Starting with what are those principles of assurance, there are 6 to be mindful of. This is also in line with the APM, the Association for Project Management, as certainly you know, the chartered body for project management. And those 6 principles are now the ones that you can see on the screen and that we are going to expand shortly. They include the principle of independence, so ensuring that we are being as objective as possible in our approach. Also accountability, the idea of having consequential assurance in place. This idea that people know what is expected of them, and also that what we are presenting does bring a consequence, either positive or negative, depending, of course, on what is that outcome. Planning and coordination. The idea of integrated assurance is one where we need to understand who is going to be involved in assurance and ensuring that everyone knows what's expected of them so that we don't have the same lines of inquiry, the same teams being asked the same questions without coordination. What we want to have is something that is structured, that is planned for as part of the integrated assurance and approvals plan. Then 2 other principles that for me go hand in hand and are at the core of what good assurance looks like. Proportionality. So not having a one-size-fits-all, but having something that is just right, just the right level of controls based on what is the complexity and the level of risk of that project. Not the level of budget, as many organizations start with, and of course it's a fair way to start, but as we mature our practice, we want to ensure that we are prioritizing the ones that are much riskier in the portfolio. And similarly important, impact, follow-up, and escalation. We want to ensure that what we are doing in assurance creates an impact, that it leads to better decisions. And as a result of it, and following this idea of consequential assurance that I referred to on accountability, that we also have a proper route for follow-up and for escalation those results. So with that short introduction, let's now have a look into further details for each of those. The first one being the principle of independence. So independence is all about being objective in our approach, not correcting our own homework. And if you are a PMO of one or an assurance team of one, if you don't have the luxury of having a separate team covering assurance, this can be a challenge for some organizations. Not in a way that we are not independent, of course, but in a way that we might be difficult to show that we are independent. The perception of independence may be a challenge. So it's quite important if you are doing assurance in the context of a PMO team, or if you don't have a separate PMO team, so support and assurance are captured or are covered under the same function, that we are quite clear on what is the hat that we are wearing when completing assurance, when completing a review. It's, I would say, better to have assurance, even though it's not 100% independent, rather than not to have assurance at all. So when it comes to independence, we want to ensure that independence has been considered throughout the life of the review. So this means, as you can see on the screen, how we are designing the strategy, referred to as programming independence. Because if you have a project that is standalone versus a project that is part of a program, this will change, for instance, where the resources are being commissioned, what is the governance surrounding that piece of review, so or even what is the budget that you are going to assign to those different levels. So programming independence is something that we should be mindful of from the very beginning. Ensuring that we are selecting resources that are not supporting that project directly, but where possible, considering also our governance hierarchy, those would be taken from the level above that hierarchy. So if you are assuring a project that is part of a program, then it would make sense, considering the principle of independence, that you have separate resources covering the project and covering the program level. Of course, if we have the luxury of having resources distributed in that way, I should stress. Then we have investigative independence. Here we are talking about the doing. So ensuring that when we are completing the review, being a project health check, being a stage gate review, post-implementation review, among several others, we want to ensure that we are objective. that we are, where possible, not biased. So for that, some tactics that you can apply would be to have a standard approach, so known communicated frameworks that people recognize, so that they know in advance what are the lines of inquiry that you are going to use. What is it that you are going to be assessing in terms of evidence, in terms of who you are going to consult. So we operate with a no surprises approach. That is a fundamental step to demonstrate that independence. And then you can also ask your peers to complete a similar assessment on that project to ensure that you are more mindful of your own blind spots and in turn strengthening your independence. Finally, reporting independence. We don't want to have the classical watermelon reporting. Projects that are showing as okay, green on the outside, and then it's only when independent assurance comes to observe that they then identify that that project is bright red on the inside. So pure watermelon reporting. Instead, we want to build an environment where the teams are comfortable in reporting the trajectory of the project, from growing to a state of concern, so from a green to an amber, and then to a state where it would require attention, it would require action from the team. So by reporting independence, we want to be objective, we want to speak truth to power, even if that means, for instance, commenting on the culture of the organization, when, where the situation of watermelon reporting is being encouraged rather than mitigated. So throughout our life cycle, designing assurance, running assurance, and then reporting on assurance, independence is one that we should be assessing ourselves. Are we as independent as we can be? Some threats to independence, I would say that the classical one is when we have a self-interest on what is being assured. So I gave you the example of separating the assurance resources involved in projects from the assurance resource involved in programs. Of course, one can argue that if a project is part of a program, and then if we have the same resources doing assurance at both levels, then that principle of independence can be compromised, or at least in perception, in appearance. Another common threat to independence is when we are invested in the, or have a self-interest on what is being reviewed. Here we could be talking about the PMO building or proposing a certain strategy for the project in terms of scope strategy, in terms of design, whatever this may be, but then completing assurance on what they have proposed initially. So effectively correcting their own homework. Can also be talking about financial interests in completing a review, familiarity, or advocating for a certain result, or even the most concerning of them all, when there is intimidation associated with the results that are being presented. So independence is a key one. Then we have the principle of accountability. So by accountability, we are referring to what is that that context, that framework of authority that has been given to assurance. And I should stress that assurance, we are not expected to be decision makers, but we should be decision enablers. So I have been given that authority to enable decisions. Do we have a sponsor to champion our work? Is that sponsor and he or she aware of their responsibilities? That they should be setting the scene for what assurance needs to be in the company? That they should be securing resources for assurance to be completed? And of course, we also have the sponsors on the individual projects and programs, rather than the sponsor of assurance as a function. Are they aware that they need to be available for reviews, committed to those reviews, that they need to make decisions, approvals on the outcomes of those reviews, and influencing others as well? So exerting some sort of peer pressure for the importance of completing assurance on projects. So that is something that should be emphasized in the organization throughout, not just when the review is due, but as part of the integrated assurance strategy and as part of just regular roles and responsibilities in job descriptions. There are also, of course, ways on how we can strengthen accountability. One of those is by promoting transparency, making it much more explicit, much more visible. What are the outcomes of assurance? This can be done through case studies, for examples of where we had challenges before, so lessons learned, where assurance could have intervened. And also, it can be done by implementing ways of reporting on the results of assurance. So for the ones of you who are using, for instance, a PPM solution, such as the Escalation Plus or any other, Power BI, whatever this may be, so in conjunction with Excel, but showing what are the results of your reviews. There's no place to hide with real-time reporting. So let's use that in our favor. Not to say that people usually have things to hide, by the way, but we do know of the watermelon reporting, as I mentioned before. So we want to create that visibility, that transparency, but we also need an environment of trust. One where if people have concerns, they should be comfortable in reporting those. So I gave the example of culture, the culture of the organization. And for me, that is usually one of the dimensions that people tend to overlook, as perceiving that culture is just something that happens to us. That's not exactly the case. This is something that working in assurance, we are in a privileged position to influence, to report, to speak that truth to power. So accountability for why we are wasting organizational resources on a project that we know is not going anywhere, that is not going to achieve its objectives. Why are we approving this pet project? So that's clear examples of where accountability comes into play and where you can also see how respected, how listened assurance is in the organization. And of course, I'm emphasizing the role of the sponsors, but we do have other roles in the organization that have their own accountabilities and responsibilities towards assurance. The role of the project manager in co-creating the integrated assurance and approvals plan, in motivating and leading the team for the importance of assurance, in setting the scene on why the review is important, why do we need to provide confidence that the project is performing as on track, apologies. Also, the role of the portfolio manager. Is the portfolio manager coordinating the provision of assurance in his or her portfolio as they should? Or even the role of the project board or equivalent steering committee. Are they championing assurance? Are they making decisions as a result of assurance? Are they identifying what are their assurance requirements in order to gain confidence that the portfolio is healthy and progressing as it should? Unfortunately, sometimes I'm faced with a situation where the ones on the ground doing assurance, they do recognize the importance of it, they are driving it, but then it's usually at the top where, or not usually, but sometimes it is at the top where that accountability, that awareness is not there. So the classical pyramid of ignorance, as some of you may know. Honestly, I believe that that is often to do with a lack of visibility too. So providing visibility, providing examples of where assurance would have taken a different role and therefore improved, changed the results of that project, I think it's a good example. So don't just consider best practices, they are important too, but use your tacit knowledge. And by this, I mean using your own case studies, your own examples of projects that have gone wrong, that have been not completed as they should because assurance was not there, because accountability was not clearly defined. Our next principle is planning and coordination. By planning and coordination, we recognize, first of all, that there are multiple assurance providers in the organization. Sometimes people tend to think about assurance as a compliance exercise done by compliance or done by the audit team, and that's it. Not at all. So there are other people in the organization doing reviews, checks, the PMO, procurement, legal, HR, finance, they are all involved. So we need to know what exactly it is that they are assuring. They may not call it assurance. They may not even know that that is classed as an element of a stage gate review. But the reality is that assurance is all about providing confidence. to our stakeholders, then the project is going as it should. So by doing those reviews, those checks, that's exactly what those teams are doing. So we need to have that cohesive, holistic view of who is involved at what point and what is the level of confidence, the reliability of their activities. This would allow us to ensure that we are covering our risks properly and also that we are minimizing any duplication of efforts, that we don't have overlaps. So it links very closely to what we were talking about accountability before, knowing who is responsible for what in the context of that project. In terms of technical assurance, but also management assurance and business assurance. The way to achieve this principle in practical terms would be by documenting and by having that visibility over who are those providers and who is receiving that information on the project. So for this example, I really like the use of a RACI tool, a responsibility assignment matrix. So the usual one, RACI, responsible, who is accountable, who needs to be consulted, and who needs to be informed. So identifying what are the different dimensions on the project and using it as a way of establishing that planning and also confirming who is going to be involved when in terms of timing and in terms of scope. So in this way, providing that visibility. This would be documented in the integrated assurance strategy. So the overarching document that explains how assurance is done in the organization, and it can also be tailored as needed in the integrated assurance and approvals plan. So the plan that is now specific to the projects and programs being assured. By planning and coordination, we are also referring to the schedule of the reviews. So a good way of ensuring that we are not losing track of when the review is due, so that you don't have a situation where the team is already pressured for delivering against a certain deadline, for instance, and all of a sudden there's a review that they need to take. No, providing that visibility, know when that review will be expected, and also if you align it with the delivery schedule. So for instance, for the ones of you who are using Microsoft Project, Planner, an equivalent scheduling solution, by introducing those reviews as activities integrated into the delivery schedule with dependencies, with filters, and so on, this would be a good way of dynamically seeing how that schedule will update. So if the project is late, then the stage gate review will also be late, or will also be updated in terms of that timing. So this would give us that opportunity to operate with a no surprises approach and also to ensure that that coordination is visible. So less surprises for the delivery teams. And I would also argue for the actual assurance teams who know when do they need to prepare for the next review. Our next principle is proportionality. Proportionality is usually the one that people tend to struggle the most with. They apply too much heat just to do coffee. But then when they need to cook properly, the oven is in the minimum. So what is that right balance? We need to be mindful of what is the level of risk that would make the level of controls, the level of assurance proportionate. So when something that is just enough, it shouldn't kill the joy of working in the project just because we have assurance involved. At the same time, we don't want to have a chaotic situation where there is no assurance at all. So what is that right balance? How can we achieve it? There are certain tools that you can use. You don't need to start from scratch. So this principle works hand in hand with the risk-based. So you can start, for instance, by identifying what is the level of risk, and then using different thresholds, different levels, identify what would be your different project types or project tiers. Based on that, we can then identify what is minimum viable, in this case, assurance, or minimum viable bureaucracy by association too, if you want to extend this to what would be also the artifacts to be used, or even the governance that would be needed. But by proportionality, we want to ensure, for instance, that we know what would be the right level or the right type of reviews. For instance, for a small project, low complexity, low level of risk, maybe it would be sufficient to just have a quarter health check. Maybe that's even too much. Maybe we just need stage gate reviews or checkpoints, a bit more informal. If we have a project that is highly complex, highly innovative in the organization, perhaps even in the industry, so high level of risk and uncertainty, that's one that we want to have more visibility of. That's one where we want to have more controls in place, more scrutiny being applied. So for that one, you may have quarterly health checks. You may also have stage gate reviews. You may also have checkpoints with the sponsor and the project team. This would also need to be adjusted with the duration of the project, of course. But we wouldn't just use the level of budget to identify how proportionate the project is, because that could turn into a risk on its own. Let me show you a practical example on the screen now. So this is from a previous life, but just to show you what could look like, what this could look like in practice. This was a tailored model, but you can also use, as mentioned, the examples that exist in the industry. So starting from the risk potential assessment as a tool, or even DECA from the National Audit Office. So in this example, we do have a number of categories or criteria. You'll need to identify your own. As mentioned, you can also start from what are industry standards and adjust as needed. And this would be an exercise that the PMO or an equivalent assurance team member would complete by sitting with the project manager and with the sponsor at the very beginning of the project. So the first step is, let's assess what is the level of risk. What is this animal that we have in front of us? Is it a small animal? Is it a large one? How do we need to tailor our approach? So some examples in terms of how innovative is this project, or the technology that this project is introducing. How clear are the requirements? This can even help you determine if a more predictive or a more adaptive approach, so more waterfall versus agile for the ones that prefer those terms, would be more suitable. We can also refer to what are the extent, or what's the extent of the business impact. What is the level of investment that will be required? Is there any regulatory constraints or requirements for this project? What is the organizational impact? Is it going to be limited to a team, or is this going to impact the full organization, perhaps even other branches and other countries? So all those options would give you a score. So this would be a practical example of how you can achieve this approach, of course, just as food for thought, just as an inspiration. And then based on the sum of those scores, you would get a result for the project. So is this a small, is this a medium? So t-shirt sizing as an approach can be quite effective in identifying what are your tiers or types of projects. But I would advise that you do not stop there. So again, use your tacit knowledge. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. So let's actually review what are the risks that we tend to have the most in the company. What are the lessons that we have been learned over the years that are recurring issues for projects? And use that as prompts to inform the project from the offset. Again, making better decisions and improving confidence. That's what assurance is there to do. So we'd ask, for instance, is this a capital project? Because maybe finance wants the team to use a specific form for it. Maybe there are specific requirements that will need to be met for capital projects. In this organization, for instance, there used to be a recurring situation where people forgot that we had SAP. And there was an important dependency. So that's from the beginning. Does this project have an interface with SAP that you may envisage? Because if it does, we want you to go and talk to this person right away. Just so that at least create that visibility. In this organization, the PMO released the sponsorship executive packet, kind of training service. So we'd ask the question, has your executive already been in this training that you have recently launched? And it went to the level of detail of even asking, and you can now see how old this is, because nowadays most people are working remotely or hybrid. But at the time, for this organization, people were using meeting rooms a lot for workshops, training, whatever that is. And we had a shortage of meeting rooms in the office. So very often people would need to go to the hotels nearby. But they only realized that needed to go into their project budget at the very last minute. So we'd ask the question, do you anticipate that you'll need to use those meeting rooms? Because if you do, here's the prompt for you to remember to put some budget aside for this. And based on those responses, we'll then identify what is that minimum viable approach. This example was not specifically designed for assurance, but we can also infer from here. So you can see what would be mandatory artifacts, what would be advisable. So I'm not going to chase you on this. We are all adults, but this is what we advise based on what good looks like. And if you have the resources, if you believe it could benefit your project, then it would be a good thing to do. And then things that would be too much, that would not bring any benefit to the project directly, that would kill the joy of working on that project because the project is not that risky. So in terms of artifacts, in terms of governance, in terms of assurance as well. So you can see some examples here. Would this project require stage gate reviews? Would it require a highlight report? Would it require EXCO approval? Or it would be sufficient to have project board approvals? What is it? And then some other considerations. In terms of financial requirements, also in stakeholder engagement would be involved, or even other considerations such as remember to factor in time zone delays, remember to add budget for the meeting rooms, whatever that is. So it's all about ensuring that we have something that is of the right size for the complexity and the level of risk of that project. And that brings us nicely to the next principle, which is indeed the fact that assurance should be risk-based. So we are referring to understanding from a delivery and from a business perspective, what is that range or that score that will make the project a small, a medium, or a large, and therefore tailor our approach so that it is a proportionate approach to assurance. Here, in order to have risk-based approach, we need to understand, first of all, if that approach is common to others in the organization. We don't want to be in a position where we are identifying this project as very risky, and then this other team over there uses a different scale, and therefore is thinking that this project is still in the medium, so that amber type of color for risk. So common framework when it comes to risk. And do you contact your risk management teams? Often they do have already frameworks that can be applicable or extendable to delivery as well, so to project delivery. So understanding what are the different levels, the scale that is being utilized, the framework, and what are the thresholds that would make it riskier or not. And use that as a basis for proportionality. Not the one, let's not assure the one that is next on the list on our portfolio register. Let's instead assure the one that is more risky. And this is not a one-off exercise. It should be initiated or it should be completed at the very start of the project. But please note that, as I'm sure you know, the profile, or have experienced perhaps, the profile of risk of the project will change over time. Given that perhaps we had a change request that will make this project now much more costly or unattainable, whatever this may be, or just because due to now new facts that have been learned as we progress in the life cycle of the project through delivery. So as a minimum, I would say this exercise, understanding what is the level of risk, should be repeated at stage gates and also in light of change requests that are being proposed. And there is the risk potential assessment from NISTA, the old IPA, that you can use if you don't have a tool to get you started. So the risk potential assessment is one that you can find online. Our last principle is impact, follow-up, and escalation. So we want to ensure that what we are producing is creating impact. If we were to ask the question when getting a report, so what? What does this tell me? Can I make better decisions as a result of this report that I received from assurance? Is the message in that report as impactful as it could be? So think about that as well when you are drafting the report, because one thing is to say that there is a cost variance of, I don't know, 50K. The other thing is to say, if you continue on this trajectory, there will be 50K at risk. One creates more impact than the other. It's the same message, but people tend to react differently, to pay attention differently. And let's also follow up and escalate our results. Assurance does not stop with the production of that report. We need to ensure that there is an action plan being produced as a result of our recommendations and our findings. We need also to ensure that those actions have indeed been implemented and are closing those risks, or at least mitigating those risks that have been identified. Working in integrated assurance, this does not mean that this would be an activity for the actual assurance team to complete. You can rely, for instance, on the PMO, particularly if you are talking about project support officers, so the ones that are assigned to that specific project. We can also work with other people in the project, so from finance, from procurement, depending, of course, on what that action is. But don't feel like it's all on you. Integrated assurance is about planning and coordinating multiple assurance providers. So all of them can contribute to that follow-up and also be involved when it comes to escalation. So when it comes to escalation, we are referring to the escalation routes. So at what point will we need to raise this concern with the finance committee, with the different portfolio committee? What are those thresholds? Would it be sufficient for us to have a reputational risk for that to be escalated? So that should not be, again, a surprise, should be defined upfront. And finally, on this principle, I also want to highlight that this would be an opportunity for us to identify areas of good practice. Assurance is not a compliance exercise, is not about just trying to find projects that are in trouble. We also want to highlight what is good practice that should be sustained, that should be replicated. We also want to encourage to make visible what are those examples of internal case studies that could support assurance in other areas. So use that as an opportunity to also showcase those good examples as part of the results of assurance. And Emma, do you want to now ask some questions about the assurance principles?
So thank you, Marissa, for taking us through the 6 principles. Some of the key things that we need to think about, as you mentioned, but just to summarize, is really being careful around who carries out assurance. And it's really important that people understand that assurance is a skill in its own right. So just because you're a project manager or a PMO person doesn't automatically mean you know exactly how to approach carrying out an audit or assurance activity. So it's important that we understand how to ask questions, how to gather evidence and things like that. So thinking about who carries out the assurance is going to be really important. Making sure that you're aware of how independent that assurance is, I think, is going to be really key as well, because that can really help with how the assurance and the results and the recommendations are taken, and how seriously they are taken, as it says on there. And we need to think about how is it going to feel for individuals. If some of you are coming from a place of, we don't really do any assurance right now, which is pretty much 4% of you looking at the poll that we had earlier around how much assurance do you actually think you're doing, then don't go full in, with everything. Make sure that it's exactly what Marissa said, proportionate to what is actually needed. If you're starting with 0, we always say you'd probably be happy with, just 20% of projects having some kind of assurance. So make sure that you think about that. And from the poll, we can see that straight away people have thought, actually, I'm doing a lot more assurance than I thought I was doing. So that's really good, because assurance can feel overwhelming. So it doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all, but it can feel like, oh, wow, where do I start? But the reality is that you're doing a lot more than you think. And the latest poll that we've just posted is around status reports. The question was, do you consider status reporting as a type of assurance? And most of you so far have said, I do now, I didn't before. So it is all about quality and making sure that you're doing the right thing at the right time for the level of maturity that you have within your organization. So yeah, do we want to go to the next slide, Marissa?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So what are the things that you can do to kind of get up to speed with all of this? And then we'll head over to some of your questions that you have that you've placed in the chat or in the Q&A. So first of all, we have lots of intelligence and topics and insights on the Wellington website. So make sure you read up on assurance, because like I said, it can be really big and it can be really scary, but it can also be the small things that you can do that can add up to add enormous value. We are seeing in the industry that assurance is actually in a way simplifying, in that it's becoming less about the big scary reviews in some cases, and more about what can we do on a day-to-day or a regular basis. So kind of making them small, a little bit more focused activities. Connect with your peers. If you're not already in the Wellington community, we have Assurance Month going on this month. That's why this webinar exists. So there is a community there that's a safe space for you to learn, share, and grow. You can't know where you're going until you know where you've been. Lots of you will have heard me say that before. You need to understand the need in your organization. Do not think that you need to go whole hog on day one. Also, review what you're currently doing, because now you might have identified that you're already doing assurance. You can already talk about assurance. It's just about what you do with those insights now. So review what you're currently doing and embrace the new stuff that's coming, whether you have access to the AIs, the co-pilots of the world, or you feel like actually we have somebody in the team that's really skilled at this, then make sure that you're kind of you're embracing what you have available to you to try and make things easier and take out some of that manual piece as well. And then make sure that you're learning with a roadmap in your mind. What is it that you actually want to be able to get to from an assurance perspective? And from a PMO perspective, the world that Marissa and I live in every day, there is no one size fits all. So think about what it is that you want to do or what you need, and then build accordingly. So that's kind of it in terms of the content. We've got a few minutes for questions, so I'm just going to open this up, and then Marissa, I'll throw some questions at you. So we'll start at the bottom. You've spoken about PMO conducting health checks. Do you have a standardized template which you use? So yes, we do. It's one of the services that we offer. And Marissa, you showed a Word document or spreadsheet or whatever that was from a previous life. I know we've got people asking for that spreadsheet, so I think maybe we look at simplifying it and just sanitizing it a little bit so that we can send something out with something a little practical for the guys that have taken the time to join this webinar. Would that be okay with you?
Yes, I would say that this should be food for thought. It was indeed a practical example that I've used in the past, but it would need to be tailored. And even without that spreadsheet, there are some good tools out there, I should say, that are available to all that I would strongly recommend. So some examples from the National Audit Office, they do have a pack of tools that are available, particularly on this principle of proportionality, DECA, the Delivery Environment Complexity Analytic, and also from the risk-based principle, the RPA, Risk Potential Assessment. So it also contains a number of questions that you can use in the same way to identify how to apply proportionality to your project.
And I think we know also, because it's part of our course, is the APM, the Association for Project Management. They have the APM guide for assuring projects, or the measures for assuring projects. And that kind of covers all of these principles as well. And in there's a whole scoring system, there's guidance characteristics. So that can be a really good place to start as well, like something you can almost lift and shift. So we'll pop some links. We'll do a companion kind of email with some of these links in, because I think that's a really good place to start for those of you that are in kind of that APM sphere. So thank you so much for joining, and we'll hopefully see you at one of our future events. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you all. See you at Future PMO, we hope. Thank you.